Hello. Tonight you stand at the edge of something older than memory, where the earth itself seems to breathe in slow silence beneath your feet. Beneath every step you take, there are layers of forgotten worlds resting gently, as if time itself has decided to pause for a moment and listen. You begin to wonder what secrets the ground has quietly kept all this time. You walk across a quiet landscape that feels almost unreal in its stillness. The air is calm, like a soft blanket resting over ancient stone. Beneath you, geological layers stretch downward like pages in a book no one has ever fully read. It feels almost like the planet is buffering, loading memories too large for human attention. The horizon remains still, stretching endlessly like a paused film frame. You notice how even the wind seems to move carefully, as if avoiding disturbing something sacred beneath the soil. Every grain of earth feels like it belongs to a forgotten chapter of existence. Somewhere in your mind, you jokingly imagine the planet asking for a coffee break after millions of years of spinning. So, before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. If you feel like it, share in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, slowly dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan, letting the steady hum of the air fill the room. And in that gentle rhythm, we quietly step into tonight's journey together. You begin to notice how the ground beneath you is not truly solid in the way it first appears. It is composed of countless sediment layers, each one formed through slow deposition over thousands or even millions of years. Geological studies of sediment cores reveal climate cycles repeating with patient regularity, as if Earth itself breathes in long, quiet intervals, almost like a sleeper shifting in dreams. As you continue walking, you imagine the deep subsurface like a vertical library. Each layer of rock represents a different moment in planetary history, carefully stacked without urgency. In real geological research, scientists extract ice cores and sediment samples to reconstruct ancient climates, revealing temperature shifts that unfolded gradually rather than suddenly. You smile, thinking the Earth might be the original archivist, though probably a very disorganized one. The silence around you feels heavier now, but not uncomfortable. It resembles the calm inside a vast museum before visitors arrive, where everything waits patiently under soft light. Fossilized pollen grains, preserved within ancient sediments, tell stories of forests that once spread across continents. These microscopic traces confirm that entire ecosystems rose and disappeared without traumatic noise, like thoughts fading quietly after waking. You crouch slightly, imagining the ground as something alive with memory. Geological time stretches so far beyond human experience that even civilizations become brief flickers. Scientists often describe Earth history using timelines so large they feel almost abstract. Yet here, it feels strangely intimate. It is like reading a book where every page takes a million years to turn, and still the story continues without hurry. A faint breeze passes, and you notice how it interacts gently with the terrain, as if respecting invisible boundaries between eras. The planet's crust has shifted slowly through tectonic motion, forming mountains and oceans over immense periods. You think about how continents once connected and separated, not through sudden force, but through movements so gradual they would be imperceptible in a single lifetime. There is a quiet humor in imagining Earth as a patient traveler who never actually arrives anywhere. Even tectonic plates, drifting at rates similar to fingernail growth, reshape entire worlds over time. You picture a geologist trying to explain this to someone impatient, only to be interrupted by a notification from a smartphone reminding everyone how differently humans measure urgency compared to nature. You begin to sense how climate patterns recorded in sediment cores reveal cycles of warming and cooling across deep time. These patterns do not behave like abrupt changes, but rather like slow breathing patterns of a vast planetary organism. Ice ages come and go in rhythms spanning tens of thousands of years, each leaving behind subtle traces encoded in minerals and isotopes. The landscape around you seems to soften further as your imagination dives deeper beneath the surface. Ancient riverbeds, now buried, once carried water across lands that no longer exist in the same form. Over time, sediment filled these channels, preserving their shapes like frozen memories. You think of it as Earth's version of saving old drafts that were never meant to be deleted, where nothing is truly erased, only gently rewritten into deeper layers of time that no one notices unless they learn how to read the silence beneath. Everything. Fossil records are not traumatic snapshots, but delicate accumulations of patience. Even a fossilized leaf reveals entire vanished ecosystems. Paleobotany shows forests shifting with climate changes so gradual they would have been invisible to any single observer, like slow thoughts forming across millions of quiet years. Every grain of soil beneath your feet belongs to cycles older than humanity itself. Geological processes have shaped Earth for over 4.5 billion years. The number feels less like measurement and more like philosophy, suggesting time here is not counted, but continuously unfolded without interruption or urgency. Volcanic activity, often seen as sudden, is part of long internal cycles building pressure over centuries. You imagine a planet never rushing, where even eruptions follow patient timing. It feels strangely comforting, as if even Earth's most dramatic moments are shaped by quiet, deliberate preparation beneath visible calmness. You begin to feel the boundary between observer and landscape soften. Walking becomes a way of entering memory itself. Each step feels like a conversation with time, spoken through layers of stone and dust that preserve everything without judgment, recording existence with patient indifference and endless continuity. Silence here is not emptiness, but presence expressed differently. Sediment, fossils, and mineral patterns form a language without words. Even tiny grain variations carry ancient environmental stories. Everything feels slow, continuous, unbroken, like Earth breathing through millions of years in a single, steady, unhurried rhythm. You find yourself walking beside vast river systems that seem to exist before any sense of human history takes shape. The water moves slowly across wide plains, carving gentle paths through earth that feels soft and patient. Everything here seems guided by repetition rather than urgency, as if the planet is quietly rehearsing life itself again and again. The Nile stretches like a long silver thread through the landscape, connecting distant regions into a single flowing story. Its waters travel with steady rhythm, never rushing, never hesitating, as though it understands exactly where it is meant to go. You imagine it as a calm traveler who never checks the time, but always arrives exactly when needed. Each year, the Nile's flood cycle rises with predictable patience, spreading nutrient-rich silt across surrounding plains. Ancient records around 3000 BCE show these floods created fertile soil supporting early Egyptian settlements. You imagine farmers watching the waters rise, unsure if it is blessing or nature forgetting its schedule again. The annual inundation slowly reshapes the landscape, transforming dry earth into fertile farmland through steady layers of deposited silt. Early communities adapt across generations to this dependable rhythm. You picture them watching the river with quiet respect, as if it follows its own invisible timetable, never asking for permission, yet always arriving exactly when life depends on it most. As the floodwaters retreat, they leave behind dark, fertile layers that slowly transform dry land into productive fields. This repeating cycle enables early Egyptian civilization to grow along the riverbanks, forming one of the earliest organized societies in human history, where life depends on predictable natural renewal rather than force alone. You can almost imagine someone in that time looking over the fields and quietly admitting that the river does most of the work. Farming becomes less about control and more about timing, as people learn to align themselves with seasonal rhythms that return faithfully each year without needing instruction or negotiation. The irrigation channels begin to appear in your imagination, like delicate veins branching outward from the river. Ancient engineers carefully guided water into fields, extending the Nile's influence far beyond its natural path. These early systems show how humans learned to cooperate with slow natural rhythms. Instead of trying to overpower them completely, wheat and barley grow in neat patches along the watered lands, supported by the predictable flooding cycles. Agriculture here does not feel rushed, but instead follows a calm rhythm shaped by seasonal changes. You think about how early farmers must have felt slightly like gardeners in a very large, very patient backyard. Settlements form gradually along the riverbanks, each one growing as families recognize the stability provided by water and soil. Over time, villages expand into structured communities, connected through shared reliance on the river's generosity. Life feels less like invention and more like gentle adaptation to something already beautifully established. The river becomes more than water. It becomes a living memory stretching across generations. Each bend carries echoes of countless seasons. Standing at its edge, you feel as if the river remembers you more clearly than you remember yourself. A thought that feels both unsettling and strangely comforting at once. Sediments drift downstream and settle into rich deposits that renew surrounding land over time. This natural process sustains long-term agriculture, allowing civilizations to flourish for millennia. Even ordinary mud becomes a silent architect of history, quietly shaping human survival without recognition or applause, layer by layer, season after season. You think of other great rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, which sustained Mesopotamian civilization through seasonal rhythms. Early cities grew along their banks through irrigation and trade. It feels as if ancient life was gently coordinated by water systems that never required instruction, supervision, or deliberate design. Across all these river worlds, water shapes civilization with quiet consistency rather than force. Flowing systems guide settlement, agriculture, and memory across generations. You realize these rivers act less like resources and more like long-lived storytellers, carrying history forward in currents that never pause, never forget, and never rush. Daily, life along the Nile unfolds in soft repetition, shaped by rising waters and falling tides. People organize routines around the river's cycles, as if time itself flows through the water. You imagine them adjusting plans not by clocks, but by watching the river's changing mood each morning, reading nature like a quiet calendar. Small boats drift along the current carrying grain, goods, and sometimes passengers who simply enjoy the slow journey downstream. Trade routes form naturally, following the river like threads sewn into the landscape. You think of it as nature's original highway system, one that moves steadily forward without traffic jams. Signals or impatient honking sounds, written records, begin to appear on papyrus, documenting harvests, taxes, and daily life. These early writings help organize society and preserve knowledge across generations. It is strangely comforting to imagine bureaucracy beginning not in offices, but in quiet riverside spaces where scribes carefully recorded the flow of both water and life. Although the river appears stable, its floods sometimes vary in strength, reminding everyone that even predictable systems contain subtle unpredictability. These variations teach early societies adaptability rather than control. You realize that stability is not the absence of change, but the ability to live peacefully. Within its slow, shifting rhythm over time, myths begin to form around the river, often personifying it as a divine presence or guiding spirit. Ancient cultures interpret its life-giving cycles as sacred, blending observation with storytelling. You imagine someone trying to explain hydrology for the first time and accidentally inventing poetry instead, which honestly feels like a fair trade. In modern terms, scientists study river systems through hydrology, measuring flow rates, sediment transport, and seasonal variation. You picture a researcher staring at data charts, while the river itself continues flowing outside the window, completely uninterested in being quantified, but politely allowing it anyway, like a patient teacher with too much experience. As you remain Beside the river, everything feels gently continuous, as though time itself is moving through water instead of clocks. Civilizations rise and settle along these banks, guided not by sudden invention, but by long, steady rhythms. The river continues forward, carrying quiet histories beneath its calm and unending surface. You arrive where early cities begin to form, and Uruk slowly emerges from scattered clusters of human dwellings. Small communities expand outward over generations, guided by necessity rather than ambition. The settlement grows like a patient organism learning to breathe. It feels oddly like watching a neighborhood Wi-Fi signal slowly gain full bars. Villages surrounding the fertile plains gradually connect through shared paths and irrigation channels. Families who once lived separately begin to gather closer for safety, trade, and cooperation. Over time, these clusters merge into structured settlements. You imagine neighbors greeting each other daily, still surprised that someone borrowed their water bucket again without asking not as populations increase. Simple spatial organization begins to appear in early urban design. Streets form naturally between buildings, creating pathways for movement and communication. These layouts are not planned with precision, but evolve through repeated use. It feels like watching a city quietly organize itself, like a messy desk slowly becoming almost tidy. Agricultural surplus becomes the foundation of stability, allowing people to specialize in different roles beyond farming. Wheat and barley production supports larger populations, reducing constant survival pressure. You picture storage granaries filling steadily, like a very slow-loading video buffer that somehow always manages to finish just in time for dinner. Religious structures rise within. Settlements, including early temple complexes, that later evolve into ziggurats in Mesopotamia. These buildings serve as centers for both spiritual and administrative life. They dominate the skyline gently, not aggressively. You imagine someone back then saying, "Yes, we built a giant step pyramid because we could." The invention of cuneiform writing marks a major turning point in human communication. First appearing in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, symbols pressed into clay tablets record transactions, labor, and goods with growing precision. Writing begins not as poetry, but as accounting. You smile imagining the first administrator inventing paperwork and immediately realizing what they had started. Clay tablets accumulate in storage rooms, preserving information about grain distribution and workforce assignments. These records ensure that resources are managed efficiently across growing populations. The repetition of entries creates a rhythm of administration. It feels like the ancient world invented spreadsheets, only far heavier and slightly more prone to cracking. Labor organization becomes increasingly structured as societies expand. Workers are assigned to specific tasks in agriculture, construction, and administration. This coordination allows cities like Uruk to function at larger scales. You imagine ancient supervisors trying to manage teams without emails, relying instead on clay notes and a lot of shouting across courtyards. Trade networks begin to extend beyond immediate settlements, connecting distant communities through exchange of goods. Materials such as stone, wood, and metals move along early routes. These exchanges strengthen relationships between regions. It feels like the world slowly discovering group chats, except messages take weeks and arrive on donkeys instead of phones. Social hierarchy becomes more defined as urban life develops. Priests, administrators, artisans, and farmers occupy different roles within the growing structure. These distinctions emerge gradually through economic and religious organization. You picture early society as a very complicated seating chart, where nobody is entirely sure if they chose their seat correctly. Seasonal cycles continue to shape daily life, especially in agricultural planning and resource distribution. Planting and harvesting follow predictable rhythms aligned with environmental conditions. Even as cities grow, they remain deeply connected to nature's timing. You imagine calendars made of clay, updated manually and occasionally dropped like fragile ancient smartphones. Governance structures slowly evolve to manage increasingly complex settlements. Decision-making shifts from informal councils toward organized administrative systems. Early rulers and officials coordinate resources, and labor with growing precision. You picture meetings where everyone argues respectfully, yet every word is recorded permanently, making ancient bureaucracy feel like a very committed, endlessly documented group project. The development of writing expands beyond administration into storytelling and record-keeping. Myths, laws, and economic data begin to coexist on clay tablets, shaping collective memory. Communication becomes more permanent and transferable across generations. You imagine civilization quietly discovering writing as a method of preserving thought, like activating a long-term storage system for society itself. It feels like humanity has discovered the save file function for civilization and immediately begins using it for everything. Ideas, transactions, and stories are all preserved with new permanence. What once existed only in speech now survives across centuries, allowing knowledge to travel further than memory alone, slowly reshaping how societies understand time. Daily life in Uruk involves constant movement through markets, temples, and workshops. People navigate structured spaces shaped by gradual urban evolution over generations. The city hums with quiet activity rather than chaos. You imagine ancient streets where everything feels purposeful yet simple as civilization organizes itself, step by step without urgency or confusion. Walking through these streets, you notice how the most advanced technology remains carefully shaped clay used for records and seals. Nothing feels rushed or overly complex. You picture a world where progress is measured slowly and nobody complains about slow updates, because every improvement arrives gently enough to become part of daily life. Archaeological discoveries in Hajil. Modern times reveal ancient settlements, layer by layer beneath the earth. Excavations uncover tablets, tools, and building foundations preserved over millennia. Each discovery adds depth to understanding early urban life. You picture archaeologists carefully brushing dust away, as if gently waking a very old sleeping computer system. Every artifact uncovered becomes a small fragment of forgotten daily life, slowly reassembled through careful study. Cities emerge again from beneath soil, not suddenly but gradually, piece by piece. You imagine history being rebooted through patient hands, where each layer removed reveals another quiet chapter of human existence waiting beneath time. Cultural memory begins to accumulate as stories, records, and administrative documents preserve collective experience. Civilization becomes something that can outlast individual lifetimes through written records. You reflect on how memory shifts from spoken tradition into physical artifacts. It feels like humanity started saving everything into a shared external hard drive buried underground. As you observe these silent settlements, you realize that urban life does not emerge suddenly, but through countless small adjustments over time. Uruk and similar cities grow like slow-moving rivers of human coordination. Everything feels continuous, patient, and layered. Even progress here seems to prefer taking its time, almost politely refusing to rush. You arrive in a landscape where cities seem to rise from the earth with unusual calm precision, as if they have been gently arranged rather than built. The Indus Valley settlements stretch before you in quiet symmetry. Streets align like careful thoughts, and everything feels organized without urgency. Like a perfectly arranged desk that somehow stays clean for centuries. You walk through what once would be Mohenjo-Daro, where urban planning reveals an extraordinary sense of order. Streets intersect at right angles, forming grid-like patterns that suggest long-term coordination. Homes are built with similar brick proportions, creating visual harmony. You imagine ancient builders quietly agreeing on design rules without ever arguing in meetings or sending long emails. The drainage system beneath the city reveals one of the most remarkable achievements of the Indus Valley civilization. Covered channels carry wastewater away from homes, maintaining hygiene across dense urban areas. Archaeologists note how advanced this system was for its time. You picture ancient engineers proudly inspecting drains like modern people checking a freshly cleaned kitchen sink. Every brick used in construction follows a consistent ratio, showing standardized manufacturing practices across settlements. This consistency suggests a shared system of measurement long before modern tools existed. You imagine workers joking that even their bricks have better teamwork than most modern group projects. Still, everything fits together with impressive calm reliability. Markets in these cities operate with structured exchange systems supported by uniform weights. Archaeological finds reveal carefully crafted stone weights used across trade networks. These standards ensure fairness and consistency in commerce. You think of it as the ancient version of everyone finally agreeing on the same currency app, without any software updates or password resets. The sense of balance extends beyond architecture into daily life, where goods move smoothly between producers and traders. Agriculture, craft production, and distribution all follow established patterns. Nothing feels rushed or chaotic. It is as if the entire civilization has collectively decided that calm efficiency is more important than sudden innovation or dramatic change. You notice seals carved with intricate symbols used for administrative and commercial purposes. These stamp-like objects help identify goods in ownership. Each design carries meaning that modern scholars still partially interpret. You imagine someone using a tiny carved stamp as their official signature and feeling very important every time they press it into clay. Further east, another transformation quietly begins in China during the rise of the Qin state. Over time, Qin Shi Huang unifies various regions, establishing centralized laws and administrative systems. The process unfolds gradually, but decisively. You picture bureaucrats slowly realizing their paperwork is about to become standardized across an entire empire, which feels both helpful and slightly terrifying. Standardization becomes a defining feature of Qin governance, including consistent units of measurement for weight, length, and volume. Roads and cart axle widths are also unified to improve transportation efficiency. This coordination allows smoother movement across vast territories. You imagine ancient engineers proudly measuring everything twice, just to avoid imperial confusion. Legal codes under Qin rule become more uniform, replacing fragmented regional systems with centralized authority. This legal unification helps maintain order across diverse populations. You think of it like replacing many different instruction manuals with one very strict, but very organized version, written by someone who definitely enjoyed labeling everything very precisely. Infrastructure development expands under this new centralized system, including roads and communication routes that connect distant regions. These pathways support trade, military movement, and administration. You picture long, dusty roads stretching across landscapes, where travelers feel both connected and slightly tired, like navigating a very early version of a global delivery network. In both the Indus Valley and Qin China, order appears not as sudden invention, but as gradual refinement of systems already in place. Urban planning, measurement, and governance evolve slowly over time. You realize civilization grows through continuity, where small adjustments accumulate quietly, shaping structure without dramatic breaks or sudden transformations. You begin to see civilization like a carefully maintained garden, where structure emerges through consistent attention rather than complete redesigns. Growth happens through repetition, correction, and steady care. Nothing is rushed or sudden. Instead, order forms layer by layer, as if society itself learns patience through the slow accumulation of everyday decisions. Water management in Indus cities continues to stand out as a quiet masterpiece of engineering. Wells, drains, and bathing areas reflect a deep understanding of urban sanitation. You imagine residents enjoying surprisingly modern-feeling hygiene systems, quietly appreciating infrastructure that works so well nobody thinks about it unless it stops working. Trade networks expand across regions, supported by standardized systems that reduce confusion and inefficiency. Goods travel between cities with greater predictability. You picture merchants feeling relieved that weights and measures finally match, like someone discovering that all their chargers actually fit the same device after years of frustration. Religious and cultural practices continue within these structured environments, blending ritual life with administrative order. Temples and public spaces often align with urban grids. You think of it as spirituality and geometry quietly agreeing to coexist, like two very different personalities sharing the same well-organized living room without conflict, despite differences. Between civilizations, both Indus and Shin societies share a deep tendency toward systemic order. Whether expressed through city design or imperial governance, stability becomes a guiding principle over long time spans. You notice that order here feels less like control and more like a slow settling of patterns into place across history. Rather than sudden imposition, structure emerges gradually through repetition, adjustment, and accumulated practice. You begin to see civilization as a process of alignment where complexity organizes itself over time. Stability is not enforced in a single moment, but formed quietly, like sediment resting into calm layers after long movement through time. Even technological development follows this quiet rhythm, with improvements emerging incrementally rather than abruptly. Tools, measurements, and administrative methods evolve through repeated refinement. You imagine innovation here as something that happens so slowly it barely interrupts daily life, like software updates that somehow install themselves without notification or restart screens. As you remain within this atmosphere of structured stillness, you begin to understand how deeply order can shape civilization without forceful imposition. Everything feels interconnected through shared standards and gradual alignment. The world here does not rush toward perfection. It simply adjusts itself again and again until balance quietly settles in. You find yourself standing at the edges of a vast and aging world, where the Roman Empire no longer feels like a single force, but more like a memory slowly dissolving into geography. The Western Empire weakens gradually over centuries, not through a single collapse, but through countless small shifts that barely announce themselves as change. Even time here seems to walk instead of run. Cities that once echoed with administrative certainty begin to feel quieter as governance becomes more fragmented. Roads that once carried imperial authority now carry only traces of trade and local movement. You imagine travelers noticing fewer official banners and more improvised signs, like a once organized office slowly turning into a shared, co-working space without management emails. The fall of Western Rome is not a dramatic moment, but a long unfolding transition between systems. Historical records describe political instability spreading gradually across provinces. Instead of sudden disappearance, institutions weaken in layers. You picture an empire slowly uninstalling itself, one feature at a time, while still pretending everything is functioning normally. Administrative centers shift toward regions that maintain stronger economic and political stability around the Mediterranean. Constantinople rises in influence as Western territories lose cohesion. Power does not vanish, it simply migrates. You imagine authority packing its invisible belongings and moving eastward, like someone changing apartments without fully notifying the old address. Trade routes begin to adjust in response to changing political landscapes. Merchants seek safer and more efficient paths across land and sea. Some traditional routes decline, while others gain importance over time. You picture commerce behaving like water again, quietly searching for new channels through shifting terrain, always adapting without ever truly stopping its movement. Like flowing water, trade avoids resistance and gradually reshapes its own pathways through necessity and opportunity. Old routes fade into memory, while new connections strengthen across regions. You imagine markets continuing their quiet circulation, never fixed in place, always responding to pressure, finding balance again through slow and continuous redirection of movement. Economic systems that once depended on centralized control become increasingly localized. Regional markets grow in importance as imperial structures weaken. Coins circulate unevenly, and trust becomes more local than universal. You imagine shopkeepers quietly recalculating value in their heads, like everyone slowly agreeing to use slightly different versions of the same app. Military presence in distant provinces becomes less consistent, contributing to gradual decentralization. Local leaders assume responsibilities once managed by imperial authority. This shift happens unevenly across regions. You think of it as a large organization slowly delegating itself into existence without ever formally announcing that leadership is no longer in the same room. Cultural identity within former Roman territories evolves through blending rather than replacement. Roman traditions merge with local customs, creating new regional expressions. Language, architecture, and daily practices adapt over time. You imagine culture behaving like overlapping playlists, where old songs continue playing softly beneath. Newer melodies without anyone pressing pause. Urban infrastructure, such as aqueducts and roads, continues to function for a time, even as political systems weaken. Maintenance becomes inconsistent, but not immediately absent. You picture ancient engineers silently, hoping someone else remembers how to fix everything, while the system itself politely continues working just a little longer than expected. Religious transformation becomes a stabilizing force during this period of transition. Early Christianity spreads across regions, gradually becoming a unifying cultural structure. Churches replace some civic functions previously held by imperial institutions. You imagine communities gathering not in grand forums, but in quieter spaces where continuity is preserved through shared belief. Historical accounts from this era often describe uncertainty, but archaeology reveals continuity beneath disruption. Everyday life persists even as political structures change. Farming, trade, and local governance continue at slower but stable rhythms. You think of it like a background process, running quietly while the operating system looks like it is restarting. The idea of fall itself becomes less accurate when viewed over long time spans. Instead, historians describe transformation stretching across centuries. Institutions dissolve gradually into successor systems. You imagine history refusing to provide a clean ending, preferring instead to fade like a long conversation that slowly becomes softer until only silence remains. Barbarian kingdoms establish themselves within former Roman territories, blending governance models with inherited Roman systems. These new political structures are not replacements but adaptations. You picture new rulers stepping into partially furnished rooms, deciding which parts of the old administration are worth keeping and which should be gently ignored. Long-distance trade continues, but becomes more regionally fragmented over time. Mediterranean commerce persists, though in altered forms shaped by new political realities. Goods still move steadily, but through different intermediaries and shifting networks. You imagine merchants rerouting like drivers navigating endless roadworks that never fully finish, only slowly changing direction with patience. Written records from the late Roman period show increasing administrative complexity at local levels. Documentation becomes essential for managing smaller political units. You picture scribes continuing their work steadily, even as the structures above them shift, like librarians calmly organizing books while the building slowly changes ownership. Archaeological layers reveal that cities do not abruptly collapse, but instead contract and reorganize over time. Population centers shift gradually rather than disappearing entirely. Some urban areas decline while nearby settlements grow. You begin to see civilization as something that adjusts slowly, reshaping itself through long periods of quiet transformation. And movement, you think of civilization here as a breathing organism, exhaling slowly into smaller, more adaptable forms rather than stopping altogether. Growth and decline occur together in balance. Nothing fully ends. Instead, structures change shape, responding to conditions over time, like a living system that continuously reorganizes itself to remain stable and functional. Despite fragmentation. Intellectual traditions survive through preservation in monasteries and scholarly communities. Texts are carefully copied and maintained across generations with steady discipline. Knowledge does not vanish. It simply relocates into quieter spaces. You imagine monks rewriting manuscripts by candlelight, preserving continuity while the outside world slowly reorganizes itself in silence and gradual transformation over time. As you observe the fading of empires, you realize that decline here is not destruction but redistribution. Power, culture, and infrastructure shift gradually into new configurations. Nothing truly ends at once. Instead, everything drifts gently and continuously, like sediments settling in a river that never stops flowing forward. You step into a vast network of movement stretching across continents, where the Silk Roads awaken as a living system of exchange. The Mongol Empire connects distant regions of Asia and Europe with surprising coherence. It feels like someone quietly stitched the world together using invisible threads, only occasionally reminding everyone that borders are more flexible than they appear. Caravans move steadily across deserts, steppes, and mountain passes, carrying goods that reflect distant cultures. Silk, spices, metalwork, and ceramics travel long distances without modern engines. You imagine traders enduring long journeys while quietly wondering if their destination still exists or if they are just following a very ambitious navigation. Error. Under Mongol rule, trade routes expand instability due to enforced security along major paths. The Pax Mongolica ensures safer passage for merchants and travelers across vast territories. You picture guards spread across landscapes, maintaining order like an early global system of coordination. This security network functions across immense distances, connecting regions under shared oversight. Travel becomes more predictable, encouraging exchange of goods and ideas. You imagine an ancient global infrastructure where protection is maintained not by technology, but by organized riders and disciplined communication across open land routes. Cities along the Silk Roads grow into vibrant exchange hubs where cultures meet and blend. Samarkand and Kashgar become places of convergence for ideas, languages, and technologies. You imagine walking through a market where every conversation sounds like a multilingual group chat without translation apps, yet somehow everyone still understands each other. Goods are not the only things traveling across these routes. Knowledge moves as well. Mathematical concepts, medical practices, and astronomical observations spread between civilizations. You picture ideas traveling like invisible passengers on caravans, quietly changing the intellectual landscape without announcing their arrival at customs checkpoints. Paper technology spreads westward from China through these trade networks, gradually transforming communication and record-keeping across multiple regions. This innovation significantly improves administration, education, and scholarly activity. You imagine scribes encountering a lighter writing material for the first time, realizing their work no longer depends on heavy, fragile stone tablets or costly parchment systems. The shift feels like a quiet revolution in daily bureaucratic life, where writing becomes faster, easier, and more portable. Information can now travel farther with fewer limitations. You picture scribes reacting with subtle relief, as if someone replaced an exhausting manual system with something smoother, like switching from stone carving to modern notebooks. Religious beliefs also travel along these routes, including Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and local spiritual traditions. These interactions create complex cultural layers across regions. You picture belief systems overlapping gently, like different melodies playing in the same quiet room, without trying to overpower each other. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, establishes relay stations across vast distances to support communication and governance. Riders change horses at regular intervals, ensuring speed and efficiency. You imagine a courier system so organized that even modern delivery services might feel slightly impressed and mildly threatened by its simplicity. Knowledge expands as scholars from different regions exchange ideas more freely than knowledge expands as scholars from different regions exchange ideas more freely than before. Astronomy and medicine benefit from shared observations across cultures. You picture scholars comparing notes under candlelight, realizing that the sky looks surprisingly similar everywhere, even if interpretations differ widely. Artistic styles begin to merge across Eurasia, influenced by continuous cultural contact. Motifs, patterns, and techniques blend into hybrid forms. You imagine a painter unknowingly combining aesthetics from multiple civilizations, creating artwork that feels like a visual conversation across continents without needing translation. Despite its vast scale, the Silk Road system functions through countless small, repeated exchanges rather than isolated major events. Each merchant interaction strengthens the wider network over time. You imagine it as a physical social platform where information and goods travel through long journeys instead of digital posts, shaping connection through movement itself across continents. Every exchange along these routes carries layered meaning beyond simple trade. A single transaction links distant regions through trust, risk, and shared dependency. You picture merchants meeting repeatedly in shifting marketplaces, slowly building relationships that hold the system together, like invisible threads forming. A structure too large to see all at once. Over time, these repeated interactions create a living network that adapts and expands without central control. Goods, ideas, and cultural fragments move continuously through this structure. You imagine the Silk Road not as a single road, but as a constantly shifting web of motion, where connection itself becomes the real foundation of civilization. Climate and geography strongly influence every stage of travel along these routes. Deserts, mountain passes, and unpredictable weather patterns determine when caravans can move safely. You picture merchants waiting for better conditions, as if nature itself acts like a strict but invisible traffic controller regulating global movement through slow environmental timing and seasonal constraint. Economic interdependence gradually deepens as regions rely on imported goods and shared production networks. No single area remains fully self-sufficient anymore. You imagine early globalization forming quietly, like distant communities, slowly realizing they share one large, interconnected household, where resources circulate continuously and survival becomes tied to cooperation across long distances. Cities such as Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age emerge as major intellectual hubs within Silk Road networks. Translation movements preserve and expand scientific knowledge across cultures. You picture scholars carefully translating texts between languages, passing ideas like a torch carried across generations, ensuring that knowledge survives travel, distance, and cultural transformation. Navigation improves through accumulated experience gathered by generations of traders and explorers. Knowledge of stars, winds, and geography becomes essential for survival on long journeys. You imagine travelers reading the night sky as a living map, constantly updating direction through observation, where the universe itself becomes a quiet guide for movement. Despite its vast reach, the Silk Road remains fragile, depending on political stability across many regions. Small disruptions can redirect entire trade flows. You picture the network as a delicate web, strong in its connections, yet sensitive to tension, where distant events quietly reshape routes without warning or immediate visibility. As you observe this interconnected world, you realize the Silk Roads carry more than goods. They carry possibilities. Every journey transfers fragments of culture, science, and imagination across continents. The world feels increasingly connected, yet still vast and silent, linked through long distances that preserve a deep sense of quiet continuity. You arrive along distant coastal regions, where the ocean breathes in long, patient cycles against the land. The Maya world unfolds not as sudden collapse, but as gradual transformation across generations. Civilization feels like shoreline sand, reshaped by water, yet never fully erased. Time itself seems to move like tides, rather than arrows. Standing there, you sense that nothing truly ends in a single moment. Instead, everything shifts slowly, adjusting its form with quiet persistence. The coastline becomes a record of change written in motion, where land and sea continue their long conversation without urgency, repeating patterns that feel older than memory itself. You walk through remnants of Maya cities, where stone structures remain partially reclaimed by forest. Population shifts occur slowly over centuries, guided by environmental pressures and social adaptation. Archaeological evidence suggests continuity rather than abrupt disappearance. You imagine ancient residents adjusting their routines, like someone slowly reorganizing a crowded room without ever fully stopping. Coastal trade networks continue to function, even as inland political centers change over time. Maritime routes remain important for exchange between communities. You picture canoes moving along shorelines, carrying goods and ideas in steady repetition. It feels like communication flows here through water itself, as if the ocean quietly remembers every journey ever made across it. Agricultural practices adapt gradually to shifting environmental conditions, such as rainfall variability and soil changes. Instead of collapsing, systems reorganize through experimentation and local knowledge. You imagine farmers testing small adjustments season after season, like quietly updating a long-running project without ever restarting the entire system. Everything feels incremental, almost patient to an extreme degree. Urban centers such as Tikal and Kopan experience long-term demographic changes rather than immediate abandonment. Populations fluctuate, with central areas sometimes declining, while smaller settlements expand nearby. You picture a city slowly exhaling its people outward, like a living organism redistributing energy, adapting continuously instead of collapsing suddenly or disappearing in a single moment. Archaeological layers reveal continuous occupation across many regions, even during periods of political restructuring. Temples are modified, reused, or repurposed rather than destroyed. You imagine builders constructing on older foundations, treating history as reusable architecture, where each generation edits existing structures instead of replacing them completely, creating continuity through layered transformation over time. Religious and ceremonial life continues shaping social organization throughout these transitions. Ritual calendars remain central in coordinating community activities and seasonal events. You picture ceremonies unfolding with steady rhythm, like cultural heartbeat signals that persist even as political or economic systems shift, suggesting tradition operates as ongoing maintenance rather than preserved. Static memory. Environmental factors such as droughts and resource distribution strongly influence settlement patterns over long periods. Communities respond gradually instead of relocating abruptly. You imagine families slowly following water sources, adjusting routes like travelers, updating a very slow-moving map that only becomes clear after many seasons of careful observation and lived experience. These adjustments create a landscape of movement, defined by patience rather than urgency. Populations shift across regions in response to subtle environmental signals. You picture society adapting like a wide ecological system, where change happens through continuous micro-adjustments rather than sudden relocation, preserving balance through long-term responsiveness and quiet resilience across generations. Across these transformations, civilization maintains continuity through adaptation rather than replacement. Cities, rituals, and settlements evolve together within shifting conditions. You realize that change here is not rupture, but layered adjustment, where each generation inherits a living system already in motion, gently reshaping it without ever fully stopping its underlying rhythm. Artistic and architectural styles evolve subtly across generations. Stone carvings, murals, and structures show gradual stylistic transitions rather than sudden artistic breaks. You picture craftsmen learning from predecessors in quiet continuity, as if creativity itself prefers slow conversations across time instead of abrupt stylistic revolutions or dramatic reinventions. Coastal ecosystems interact closely with human settlement patterns, shaping agriculture, fishing, and trade. Mangrove zones and shorelines provide both resources and challenges. You imagine communities learning to read tides the way others read calendars, treating the ocean as a partner in daily planning rather than a separate force. Trade connections across coastal regions remain active, linking different cultural zones through maritime exchange. Goods and ideas continue moving even as political boundaries shift inland. You picture small vessels traveling steadily along coastlines, like persistent messages delivered across vast distances without digital signals or instant communication. Systems always maintaining quiet continuity through changing times. Settlement patterns reflect adaptation to both environmental stability and long-term change. Instead of centralized expansion, communities spread into flexible networks. You imagine civilization behaving like a shoreline ecosystem, constantly adjusting shape under external pressure, yet preserving continuity beneath visible transformation, as if society itself learns to bend rather than break across generations. Of gradual change, technological developments occur gradually through incremental refinement of existing methods. Tools, farming techniques, and construction practices evolve over generations. You picture innovation not as sudden invention, but slow improvement passed from one hand to another like shared memory, where each generation contributes small adjustments without dramatic disruption or visible breaks in continuity. Population movement follows environmental cycles and resource availability rather than strict political directives. People relocate gradually in response to long-term conditions. You imagine migration patterns resembling slow currents, invisible in single moments, but clearly visible when observed across centuries, forming steady flows shaped by necessity, patience, and environmental rhythm, rather than urgency or force. Coastal geography plays an active role in shaping civilization's rhythm over time. Rising and falling water levels influence settlement stability and agricultural planning. You picture coastlines breathing gently, expanding and contracting like a living boundary, never fixed or final, always shifting subtly in response to deeper environmental forces operating across long temporal scales. Despite regional differences, the broader Maya world maintains cultural continuity through shared knowledge systems. Writing, astronomy, and calendrical traditions persist across generations. You imagine knowledge circulating quietly like an underground river, flowing beneath visible change, carrying fragments of memory forward even when surface structures transform, collapse, or reorganize over extended periods of time, not as you remain. Along these coastal landscapes, you realize change here is not disappearance, but transformation through rhythm. Everything moves slowly, like repeating waves without urgency. Civilization does not end abruptly. It reshapes gently, leaving traces, like patterns in sand that the sea revisits again and again without ever fully erasing its memory. You find yourself moving through a quiet corridor of history where knowledge survives not through empires, but through careful hands and patient repetition. After the fragmentation of earlier powers, learning does not disappear. Instead, it retreats into monasteries and scholarly centers, especially within the Byzantine world, where texts are preserved with extraordinary care and attention. In these Byzantine monasteries, scribes work in dim light, copying manuscripts line by line with slow precision and steady discipline. Each word is transferred carefully to new parchment, ensuring that ancient knowledge is not lost across generations. You imagine the silence of these rooms, broken only by the soft scratch of ink, like time itself whispering through paper. The preservation of classical texts becomes a quiet mission carried forward across many generations of devoted copyists. Philosophical works, scientific observations, and historical accounts are duplicated repeatedly with great care. You picture monks treating every manuscript like a fragile memory that could vanish if handled too quickly or carelessly in any single moment. Even as political landscapes shift and fragment around them, these centers of learning remain remarkably stable and enduring. Libraries and scriptoria function as anchors of continuity within uncertain times. You imagine them like islands of calm in a changing world, where ideas are carefully protected from disappearance through structured repetition and disciplined attention. Within these spaces, knowledge is not treated as possession, but as responsibility passed carefully from one generation to the next. Every copied page becomes an act of preservation against forgetting. You picture time slowing down in these rooms, as if history itself pauses briefly whenever ink meets parchment in quiet concentration and care. Across centuries, this patient work ensures that intellectual traditions survive beyond political collapse or cultural disruption. Manuscripts endure because they are constantly renewed through copying and care. You realize that continuity here is not about permanence, but about repetition, where knowledge survives by being gently rewritten again and again without end. Meanwhile, in the Islamic Golden Age, a connected intellectual expansion unfolds across the Abbasid Caliphate. Scholars engage in large-scale translation, preserving and extending Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. You picture Baghdad's House of Wisdom as a continuous conversation between civilizations, where ideas meet without direct contact yet still understand each other across time and distance. Translation becomes one of the most powerful intellectual tools of this era. Works in mathematics, medicine, and philosophy are rendered into Arabic and refined through commentary. You imagine ideas changing languages, like travelers changing clothing for different climates, adapting to new environments while preserving their essential meaning and identity across cultural boundaries. Scientific inquiry flourishes as scholars build upon inherited knowledge from multiple traditions. Astronomy, algebra, and medicine develop through careful observation and synthesis. You picture researchers comparing star charts across regions, realizing the sky remains constant, even as interpretations shift, revealing a shared celestial order. Beyond cultural and geographic differences, medical knowledge advances through detailed documentation of treatments, anatomy, and clinical observation. Physicians compile extensive manuals that combine earlier texts with new experience. You think of early hospitals as places where knowledge accumulates slowly, like layered sediment forming over time, creating deeper understanding of the human body through continuous practice and refinement. Mathematics evolves significantly during this period through refinement of numerical systems and algebraic methods. Concepts move across cultures and improve through collaboration and commentary. You imagine numbers themselves traveling between civilizations, gaining new meanings while remaining universally recognizable, like shared symbols that adapt without losing their core structure or logical identity. The preservation and expansion of knowledge function as continuous processes rather than isolated achievements. Each generation contributes small refinements instead of complete reinvention. You picture intellectual progress as a long chain where every link depends gently on the strength of the previous one, extending forward without breaking, gradually, forming an unbroken continuum of understanding. Across this era, knowledge behaves like a living system sustained by movement, translation, and accumulation. Ideas circulate through scholars, texts, and institutions across vast regions. You realize that learning here is not static possession, but ongoing exchange, where civilizations collectively shape understanding through patient collaboration across time, language, and geography. Even religious institutions contribute to preserving knowledge. Theological scholarship often overlaps with philosophical inquiry, ensuring texts are studied from multiple perspectives. You imagine debates held in quiet rooms where disagreement is gentle, like adjusting a lamp's angle rather than overturning a table, preserving clarity while maintaining respect and intellectual patience across generations. Trade routes indirectly support intellectual exchange by connecting distant regions across vast territories. Scholars, merchants, and travelers carry books and ideas alongside goods. You picture manuscripts traveling in wooden crates through deserts and seas, unaware they are shaping intellectual futures far beyond their origins, quietly influencing civilizations they will never directly see or understand. Libraries become symbolic centers of stability during uncertain historical periods. They hold accumulated wisdom from multiple eras and cultures within carefully preserved collections. You imagine walking through endless shelves like corridors of memory, where every scroll and codex represents a centuries-long conversation, continuing quietly without interruption, preserving continuity across shifting political and cultural landscapes. Copying texts by hand requires patience rarely demanded in modern life. Scribes develop deep concentration and steady rhythm through repetition. You picture them working in near meditation, where each copied sentence feels like an act of preservation against time's erosion, ensuring knowledge survives despite fragile materials and unpredictable historical disruptions. Errors in copying sometimes introduce variations that later scholars must interpret or correct. This creates subtle evolution within texts over generations. You imagine knowledge behaving like a living organism, gently adapting as it moves between hands, never fully fixed, always slightly reshaped by human attention, interpretation, and the unavoidable imperfections of transmission. Despite geographic and cultural differences, intellectual traditions begin to overlap more significantly over time. Greek philosophy, Islamic science, and other systems interact through translation and commentary. You picture ideas forming bridges across civilizations, allowing thinkers separated by distance and language to influence one another without ever meeting in physical space. As you observe this long continuity of learning, you realize that knowledge does not belong to any single empire or moment in time. It flows across boundaries, preserved through care and repetition. Like a river that never stops moving, it carries fragments of every civilization it passes through, quietly shaping the future. You find yourself standing at the edge of a transformation that does not announce itself loudly, yet changes everything it touches. In 15th century Europe, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press begins reshaping how knowledge moves through society. It feels less like an explosion and more like ink slowly spreading through dry paper across time. This quiet invention gradually expands its influence across generations, altering how ideas are preserved and shared. Knowledge no longer remains fixed within fragile manuscripts or limited hands. Instead, it begins to circulate more freely, like a slow current forming new paths, through a landscape that is steadily learning a different rhythm of communication. Early printing workshops are dim, warm spaces filled with the scent of oil, ink, and wood. Movable type letters are carefully arranged by hand, forming pages destined for repeated reproduction. You imagine workers treating each small metal letter like a tiny building block of civilization, slightly heavy, yet surprisingly cooperative. In their precise arrangement, the Gutenberg Bible becomes one of the first major printed works, completed around the 1450s. Its production marks a turning point in European intellectual history. You picture scribes and printers gradually realizing, perhaps in quiet moments, that their carefully guarded craft is shifting towards something far more widely shared than ever before in human experience. This transition does not feel sudden, but steadily unfolding through each printed page. What was once rare and sacred begins to multiply with mechanical precision. You imagine the workshop atmosphere holding a strange mix of reverence and uncertainty, as if knowledge itself is learning a new way to exist in the world. Books begin to multiply in ways previously unimaginable across Europe. Where manuscripts were once rare and expensive, printed texts gradually become more accessible across social classes. You imagine knowledge learning to travel faster, like a river finding new channels, through softened ground after centuries of being carefully contained and controlled within limited spaces. Reading slowly expands beyond monasteries and elite circles into educated merchant and artisan communities. Literacy grows over generations rather than overnight. You picture families discovering books as shared objects, passed around like carefully handled artifacts that contain entire worlds within their pages, quietly transforming how people experience learning and imagination. Universities begin to benefit from the increased availability of printed material across regions. Scholars can reference identical texts rather than relying on fragmented handwritten copies. You imagine academic discussions becoming more precise, as if everyone finally agreed to use the same map instead of slightly different sketches of the same intellectual territory. Standardization of texts becomes one of the quiet but powerful effects of printing technology. Errors in copying decrease, while consistency increases across regions. You picture knowledge slowly ironing itself into stable forms, like fabric carefully smoothed after centuries of being folded, refolded, and reshaped by human hands and interpretation. Religious texts, especially the Bible, become more widely distributed across Europe. This accessibility influences spiritual life and personal interpretation. You imagine individuals reading sacred texts privately for the first time, quietly surprised that meaning can be discovered without always relying on distant intermediaries or formal institutional guidance. The printing press also contributes to the spread of scientific and philosophical ideas across borders. Works by classical and contemporary thinkers circulate more easily than before. You picture ideas traveling like quiet passengers in wooden crates, crossing regions and seas without permission, gradually reshaping intellectual landscapes through steady, persistent movement. Communication between intellectual communities becomes more synchronized as printing spreads. Scholars in different regions can engage with the same material almost simultaneously. You imagine conversations stretching across countries without delay, as if Europe has formed a shared library that removes distance, allowing knowledge to circulate freely without requiring physical presence or direct travel between places. Despite this expansion, change remains gradual rather than immediate or disruptive. Not everyone gains access to printed materials at the same time, and manuscript traditions continue alongside printing. You picture two systems coexisting like overlapping waves, slowly merging over time without one erasing the other, preserving continuity, while new methods slowly gain influence. Printing workshops spread across European cities, each adapting techniques to local conditions and resources. The technology evolves through incremental refinements rather than sudden reinvention. You imagine artisans adjusting presses, like gardeners tending soil, making small improvements over time until production becomes smoother, more reliable, and increasingly consistent across different regions and workshops. Languages begin to stabilize, as printed texts encourage standardization in spelling, grammar, and structure. Regional variations persist, but written forms gradually become more unified. You think of language gently aligning itself, like scattered threads slowly woven into a coherent fabric, forming consistency without completely erasing the richness of local expression. Maps and scientific diagrams become more widely distributed, transforming navigation, exploration, and understanding of distant regions. Visual knowledge begins to travel alongside written text across many lands. You imagine sailors and explorers relying on printed maps that feel more dependable than earlier sketches, even though the world they describe still contains uncertainty and gaps. These new maps give structure to journeys that were once guided only by memory and experience. Coastlines, stars, and routes are recorded with growing consistency, shaping how people imagine the world. You picture explorers trusting paper representations while still facing unknown seas, where every voyage balances between measured knowledge and unpredictable reality. The spread of printed material also influences political thought across societies. Ideas about governance, rights, and social organization circulate more widely than before. You picture discussions forming quietly in study rooms and taverns, where printed pages allow distant voices to participate in conversations they could never physically join or influence directly. Economic systems feel the impact of printing as record-keeping and accounting become more standardized and efficient. Merchants and administrators rely on consistent documentation. You imagine commerce becoming more orderly, like a marketplace where everyone finally agrees on shared measurements after centuries of improvisation, reducing confusion and increasing coordination across regions. As you observe this slow revolution, you realize printing does not replace human knowledge, but expands its reach and circulation across societies. Ideas no longer remain confined to isolated manuscripts or limited spaces. Instead, they travel outward steadily like light, spreading across dawn, gradually illuminating wider regions, gently transforming understanding without abrupt disruption or sudden change in daily intellectual life. You find yourself entering a world where oceans no longer separate civilizations, but connect them in expanding, complicated networks. The age of maritime exploration reshapes global geography through long sea routes. It feels like someone has redrawn the map of the world slowly, layer by layer, without erasing the traces of what came before. Ships begin to traverse vast distances across the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans, carrying goods, people, and ideas. These journeys are long, uncertain, and deeply transformative. You imagine sailors staring at endless horizons, where the ocean feels less like water and more like an extended silence that must be crossed patiently. The colonial period introduces new systems of global exchange that link distant continents together. European powers establish trade routes and settlements across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. You picture the world gradually turning into a connected network, like a web slowly tightening around the surface of the planet without any single center of control. Economic systems begin to intertwine across regions, forming early foundations of global capitalism. Goods such as sugar, spices, textiles, and precious metals circulate widely. You imagine markets expanding beyond local boundaries, as if every village suddenly discovered it was part of a much larger and more complicated marketplace. The Colombian exchange transforms ecosystems on a global scale, introducing crops, animals, and diseases between continents that were once separate. Maize, potatoes, and tomatoes spread across the world over time. You picture plants quietly traveling across oceans like hidden passengers, reshaping diets, agriculture, and landscapes in ways no one could have predicted at the beginning of this process. This slow movement of life creates long-term ecological and cultural change across many regions. Entire food systems shift as new crops take root in distant soils. You imagine humanity unknowingly rearranging global nature through trade, where each voyage carries seeds of transformation, gradually rewriting how societies eat, farm, and understand their connection to the natural world. At the same time, unintended consequences emerge from this global exchange. Populations in some regions decline dramatically due to introduced diseases. You think of history here, not as a straight line, but as overlapping waves, where every movement creates effects far beyond what anyone originally intended or understood. Colonial administrations establish systems of governance that integrate local regions into larger imperial structures. These systems often replace or restructure existing political orders. You imagine bureaucratic frameworks spreading across continents like invisible grids, organizing territories in ways that feel both structured and deeply uneven. At the same time, cultural interaction becomes more complex as indigenous traditions encounter external influences. Some practices merge, others persist, and many adapt over time. You picture cultures not as static entities, but as flowing currents, gently mixing without fully dissolving, creating layered identities that continue evolving across generations. Languages begin to shift under the influence of global contact across trade and migration routes. New dialects and Creole languages emerge in busy ports and colonial regions over time. You imagine conversations blending multiple linguistic systems naturally, like musical instruments from different traditions playing together in an unplanned yet strangely coherent harmony across human interaction. These linguistic changes do not happen abruptly, but develop gradually through daily communication between diverse communities. Words, sounds, and grammar forms mix and adapt in shared spaces where cultures overlap. You picture language evolving as a living system, constantly reshaped by contact, necessity, and exchange, forming new ways of expression without losing whole connection to its origins. Religious systems also expand and transform during this period of global interaction. Missionary activity spreads beliefs across continents, often blending with local spiritual practices and traditions. You picture faith adapting quietly to new environments, like a plant growing in unfamiliar soil, changing its outward form while still retaining its essential structure beneath the surface. Urban centers in colonial territories grow rapidly due to trade and administrative concentration. Ports such as Havana, Calcutta, and Rio de Janeiro become important nodes in global networks. You imagine these cities as meeting points of distant worlds, where every street carries echoes of multiple continents simultaneously. Labor systems change significantly, including plantation economies that rely on forced and coerced labor across vast territories. These systems create deep social and economic inequalities that persist for generations. You think of this history as heavy layered sediment, settling unevenly, remaining visible long after the original processes have ended, and reshaped societies permanently over time. Technological exchange continues through maritime routes, with navigation tools and shipbuilding techniques steadily improving over centuries. The compass, detailed maps, and stronger vessels enable longer, more reliable journeys across oceans. You picture explorers navigating immense waters with tools that feel advanced for their era, yet still fragile against the overwhelming scale and unpredictability of nature itself. Scientific knowledge expands through global observation and systematic data collection across continents. Naturalists document unfamiliar plants, animals, and climates encountered in distant regions. You imagine early researchers compiling vast notebooks of strange species, gradually realizing the world is far more diverse, complex, and interconnected than earlier regional perspectives had ever suggested or understood. Economic dependency grows between colonies and imperial centers, creating asymmetric relationships that shape global development patterns. Resources flow in structured yet unequal directions across continents. You picture the world economy as interconnected rivers, some carrying heavy outward movement, while others return only partially, leaving imbalance as a persistent structural feature of global systems over time. Resistance and adaptation appear. in many regions as local populations respond to external control and influence. These responses range from negotiation to subtle cultural preservation practices. You imagine history unfolding as a quiet dialogue between forces, where neither side fully dominates, yet both continuously reshape each other through long and long, evolving interaction over generations. Despite disruption and inequality, global networks continue to expand, linking distant regions through trade, knowledge, and cultural exchange. Systems evolve through tension, cooperation, and adaptation. You realize civilization here functions like a vast interconnected field, constantly adjusting itself, where movement never fully stops, and every action contributes to long-term global transformation. As you observe this global reconfiguration, you realize that the world is no longer a collection of isolated civilizations, but a deeply interconnected system. Yet this connection is uneven, complex, and layered. Everything moves across oceans and borders in slow, overlapping waves, shaping a planet that is quietly becoming unified while still profoundly diverse. You find yourself in a world that appears fast on the surface. It reveals deeper rhythms that remain surprisingly steady. The Industrial Revolution reshapes production, energy use, and labor, but beneath the machinery, life continues to follow cycles as old as agriculture itself. It feels like time has changed its clothes, but not its heartbeat. Factories rise across cities, powered by steam engines that transform coal into motion. Work becomes organized around shifts and mechanical timing. You imagine workers adjusting to factory whistles instead of sunrise, as if human schedules are now gently synchronized with machines that never seem to get tired or distracted. Despite industrial acceleration, daily life still follows natural cycles. People rest, eat, and gather in rhythms shaped by biological needs rather than machinery alone. You picture a world where clocks and seasons quietly negotiate with each other, neither fully dominating the other, like two systems sharing the same space politely. Urbanization spreads gradually over decades and centuries, not through sudden transformation, but continuous expansion. Rural populations migrate into growing cities in search of opportunity. You imagine cities expanding like slow-growing coral reefs, layer by layer, absorbing human activity without ever announcing a final boundary or finished shape. Railways and steamships connect distant regions more efficiently than ever before. Travel time decreases significantly, reshaping perceptions of distance. You picture landscapes passing by in rhythmic motion, where the world outside windows becomes a moving painting that never fully stops, only changes perspective with every mile traveled. Electricity begins to transform urban environments, introducing new patterns of light and activity. Streets remain illuminated beyond sunset, extending daily productivity. You imagine cities glowing at night like artificial constellations on Earth, as if humanity has slowly mirrored the stars by scattering its own small points of brightness below. Communication technologies, like the telegraph and telephone, compress time between distant locations. Messages travel faster than physical movement. Communication technologies, such as the telegraph and later telephone, compress time between distant locations. Messages travel faster than physical movement, altering coordination and decision-making. You picture words traveling invisibly through wires, like thoughts escaping the limits of geography and arriving almost instantly at distant points on the map. Industrial production introduces standardization in goods, making items more uniform and widely accessible. Mass production changes consumption patterns across societies. You imagine objects becoming more predictable, like a world where everything suddenly follows a shared template, quietly reducing randomness in everyday material life without anyone explicitly noticing it first. Scientific advancement accelerates through collaborative research and institutional support. Universities and laboratories become central spaces for innovation. You picture researchers working in structured environments, slowly refining knowledge step by step, like gardeners carefully pruning uncertainty until clearer understanding begins to grow from repeated observation and experimentation. Despite technological change, social structures evolve gradually rather than being completely replaced. Families, communities, and cultural traditions adapt to modern conditions. Families, communities, and cultural traditions adapt to modern conditions. You imagine continuity existing beneath transformation, like roots extending through soil, while the surface landscape changes appearance over time without disconnecting from what came before. Medical science improves significantly over time, increasing life expectancy and reducing the impact of many diseases across populations. Hospitals become more organized, structured, and effective in treatment methods. Healthcare systems evolve gradually, refining tools and knowledge across generations for better, precise patient care. Yet despite technological and scientific progress, medicine still remains deeply dependent on human care, attention, and compassion at its core. You imagine modern hospitals as places where advanced instruments and data coexist with quiet moments of empathy, where healing is shaped not only by precision and science, but also by steady human presence and understanding. Education expands broadly, becoming more accessible through developing public systems and institutional structures across many regions. Literacy rates rise steadily over time as more communities gain access to formal learning. You imagine classrooms gradually filling with generations of learners, like waves arriving one after another, each building slightly more knowledge upon foundations left by the previous one. This expansion of education does not occur suddenly, but unfolds through long-term social and political investment. Schools become more structured, and learning becomes part of everyday life for wider populations. You picture knowledge spreading quietly through society, like light filtering into more rooms, slowly changing how people think, communicate, and understand the world around them. Global transportation networks create deeper interdependence between regions. Goods, people, and ideas circulate continuously across continents. You picture the planet becoming more like a single connected system, yet still full of local variations, like a vast organism where each part moves in coordination but retains individuality. Technological innovation continues in incremental steps rather than sudden leaps. Improvements in computing, engineering, and material science accumulate over time. You imagine progress behaving like a staircase made of small, almost unnoticeable steps, where each advancement feels modest alone, but transformative when viewed collectively across decades. Cultural exchange intensifies through media, travel, and communication technologies. Music, film, and literature circulate globally. You picture cultural forms traveling like migrating birds, adapting to new environments, while still carrying recognizable patterns from their origins across long distances and diverse audiences. Environmental awareness grows as industrial activity reveals long-term ecological impact across regions and generations. Societies begin to reconsider energy use, resource consumption, and sustainability practices more seriously. You imagine humanity slowly realizing it is part of a larger ecological system, like a passenger gradually understanding that the vehicle they are in is the entire planet itself. This awareness does not emerge instantly, but develops through observation, scientific study, and visible environmental change. Air, water, and land conditions shift enough to prompt reflection on long-term consequences. You picture communities adjusting their thinking step by step, recognizing that human activity is deeply interconnected with natural systems that operate on much larger temporal scales. Even with all these changes, human daily experience remains anchored in familiar biological and social routines. People continue to sleep, eat, work, and rest in repeating cycles shaped by habit and necessity. You picture modern life as a layered system, where rapid technological motion exists on the surface, while deeper rhythms remain steady beneath it. As you observe this modern continuity, you realize that change here is not rupture, but accumulation. Every innovation builds upon earlier systems, and every transformation carries traces of what came before. The world feels both new and ancient at the same time, moving forward while quietly preserving its underlying rhythm of continuity. You find yourself at the end of everything that was once called history, standing in a space where time no longer feels divided into rise and fall. Empires appear here like thin layers of sediment, formed slowly, then buried quietly beneath newer layers of existence. Nothing truly disappears. It simply becomes part of deeper silence. You walk across landscapes shaped by geological time, where mountains, oceans, and continents feel more permanent than any civilization. Geological data suggests that human history is only a brief moment within Earth's vast timeline. You imagine entire empires existing like passing weather patterns on a planet that barely notices their arrival. Ancient ruins lie scattered across continents, gradually reclaimed by natural processes. Stone structures erode, forests grow through abandoned cities, and rivers shift their paths without concern for human design. You picture civilizations slowly being rewritten by nature, like ink fading from a page that was never meant to last forever. Archaeological layers reveal countless civilizations stacked over one another, each representing a different moment in time. Beneath every city lies another city, and beneath that another. History as a vertical archive, where each layer is a quiet reminder that nothing remains fixed on the surface of the Earth for long. Geological evidence shows climate shifts, tectonic movements, and natural cycles continuing regardless of human activity. Ice ages come and go, continents drift, and sea levels rise and fall. You realize Earth operates on a scale far beyond human intention, indifferent to observation or presence. It feels like a system unfolding on its own terms, never pausing to acknowledge human awareness. Processes move slowly yet persistently, shaping landscapes over immense time. You imagine a planet that never checks whether anyone is watching, continuing its transformations with quiet, uninterrupted certainty. The concept of empire becomes increasingly fragile when viewed across deep time. Political structures that once seemed absolute dissolve into patterns of migration, trade, and adaptation. You imagine authority itself becoming something temporary and weightless, like footprints in sand that are slowly erased by wind and tide. Even great centers of power eventually lose definition, not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual fading. Administrative systems weaken, cities shrink, and influence disperses. You picture power behaving like light at sunset, not vanishing suddenly, but stretching thinner until it merges quietly with surrounding darkness. Data preserved in geological and archaeological records shows how short-lived human civilizations are compared to planetary time. Entire eras of cultural development occupy only narrow layers in Earth's memory. You imagine humanity as a brief conversation held by the planet, interesting but not permanent in its attention. Languages once spoken across vast empires gradually transform or disappear over long periods of time. New languages emerge, carrying fragments of older ones within their structure. You picture words drifting through time like echoes in empty valleys, slowly changing shape with each repetition. Their original meanings become distant, layered, and increasingly difficult to recognize clearly. This transformation happens not through sudden breaks, but through continuous use across generations. Speakers adapt expressions to new environments, blending influences from contact and change. You imagine language behaving like flowing water, reshaping itself with every passage through human memory, where meaning is preserved only partially, always shifting, yet never completely lost in silence. Technologies that once defined entire eras eventually become obsolete and buried beneath newer systems and innovations. Tools, machines, and infrastructures are repeatedly replaced as societies evolve. You imagine innovation as a cycle of creation and abandonment, where each generation builds upon the remains of earlier designs, without ever preserving them in permanent form. Like waves reshaping a shoreline, human invention constantly builds and erases its own foundations over time. Structures appear stable only briefly before being altered by new forces of need and imagination. You picture progress not as linear accumulation, but as continuous rewriting, where every advancement carries the traces of what came before it. Human memory becomes increasingly fragmented across generations, preserved in records, artifacts, and later digital systems that attempt to extend its reach. Yet even these storage forms remain temporary on geological timescales. You picture information accumulating like layers of frost, always vulnerable to melting, reformation, and redistribution under shifting environmental and historical conditions. From this perspective, the idea of permanence begins to dissolve entirely. Nothing created by human hands remains unchanged over deep time. You realize that stability is only a temporary alignment, like patterns in flowing water that appear solid for a moment before breaking apart again into continuous, ungraspable movement across time. Natural forces continue their slow transformations without interruption or concern for human perception. Erosion reshapes mountains, sediment gradually forms new land, and oceans redraw coastlines over vast periods. You imagine Earth as a patient sculptor, endlessly rewriting its own surface while remaining indifferent to the brief marks left by civilizations. Seen this way, human history becomes a thin layer across a much larger process of planetary change. Civilizations appear and disappear like temporary patterns on an evolving surface. You picture time itself as the true force of continuity, quietly absorbing every structure, leaving only transformation as its lasting signature. In this vast temporal scale, even modern infrastructure appears transient. Cities, roads, and technologies eventually decay or transform. You picture future landscapes where current structures exist only as faint impressions beneath newer environments. Like forgotten drafts beneath layers of rewritten history, scientific understanding reinforces the insignificance of individual civilizations within planetary time. Yet this insignificance is not emptiness, but context. You imagine humanity as a brief illumination within a much larger system, meaningful in experience, but temporary in duration. Like a spark observed within endless night. Despite this vast scale, traces of human existence persist in subtle ways. Fossils, isotopic signatures, and sediment layers preserve evidence of life. You picture Earth quietly recording everything, not as a storyteller, but as a passive archive that retains impressions without interpretation or judgment. As you stand within this eternal silence, you realize that endings are not final moments, but gentle transitions into deeper layers of continuity. Empires fade, civilizations dissolve, and yet time continues without interruption, flowing onward in a calm, steady rhythm. Everything passes, but nothing is truly lost, only softly transformed. The script comes to a close. Thank you all for listening.